This presentation is about segregation in schools and the relationship between residential housing and open enrollment in Minnesota. In 1954, the U.S. Department of Education Civil Rights Office ordered desegregation of schools across the country. 77% of black students and 55% of Latino students attended schools that were made up of 50% to 100% of racial minorities. In 2010, more than 55 years after segregation, the National Center for Education Statistics found that 74% of black students and 80% of Latino students still attend schools that are 50% and 100% of minority students. Furthermore, 40% of the black and Latino students attend schools that have 90% higher demographics of minority students. The Twin Cities has a progressive and forward-thinking approach, but yet still has one of the nation's widest racial disparities and some of the nation's worst segregation, due in part to the layout of affordable housing in certain school areas in the city. The concentration of black families in low-income areas has grown for over a decade. In the slides before, the numbers listed are very important because they specifically show that black and Latino students are more segregated today in the 21st century than in the 1960s prior to desegregation. There are two things we need to look at in order to make changes happen: the open enrollment policy and residential segregation.
When we took a look at stakeholder perspectives, we saw that there was either groups that were trying to maintain the status quo of segregation or working to dismantle it. The four groups that we looked at were local government, businesses and nonprofits, parents, and school administrators. For local government, we've seen that years of segregationist practices have led to where we are today. Ta-Nehisi Coates puts it best when he says, "The geography of America would be unrecognizable today without the racist social engineering of the mid-20th century." A site like Flint, Michigan is a perfect example of the collusion with local officials, businesses, and schools, and then individual racist attitudes coupled with structural forces like racial zoning, discriminatory home finance program, restrictive housing covenants, and legally mandated segregation, and also gerrymandered school zone lines. In current-day Minnesota, where we have present-day affordable housing, it's placed in impoverished city neighborhoods with no access to jobs or adequate resources, and there is a reluctance from white affluent suburbs that are hesitant to allow affordable housing in their areas. Minnesota has tried to right some of these wrongs with fair housing laws, but as the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity states, they haven't guided the housing policies for decades. Political leaders are now set to further weaken these laws. This political apathy has allowed highly profitable engines of segregation to flourish in our schools and neighborhoods. With businesses and nonprofits as stakeholders, we see that they have a strong moneyed interest in working with local, regional, and state government and have a vested interest in maintaining the segregated status quo. Even though some are well-intended, there is a growing privatized poverty industry and has itself become the new bulwark of segregation in housing and schools. Nonprofit organizations fight for funding to spend on low-income housing concentrated in the region's poorest neighborhoods where there are no jobs and where there are schools from which most children fail to even graduate, and they also function as pathways to prison. Now we have parents as stakeholders. Parents are trying to make the best decisions for their children's success. There is also explicit and implicit bias that works into the racial animus that we still see that plays a role in some decision making. Some parents don't have the access to the same resources, which makes the best choice for their kids even harder. Resource parents choosing what's best often leads to more segregation. The question we have to ask is, are we okay with that? The final group is school administrators and leaders, and we see that the values we hold often are seen in the makeup of our schools. We have to deal with the local politics and money interests and the reality of the location of the school we are in. Our schools may be segregated due to the residential segregation around us. We have to ask some key questions. What do we value and how is it shown? Is integration as important to us as achievement? To believe that the success of all students is important? Do we believe that integration is part of the success of our students? And are we ready to get our hands dirty, changing policies at school and at a local level to make integrated schools and society a possibility? When we looked at the impact of segregated schools and residential areas, we saw that they are areas of concentrated poverty where resources are limited, and this is especially true in schools that are located in our cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And we also see that resources are not shared equitably. And many stakeholders have moneyed interest in upholding racially segregated status quo. And now one common set of buzzwords that we are used to defend the allocation of resources to segregated neighborhoods is equity in place. The notion that low-income communities of color can be and should be restored from poverty without any fundamental change to the living patterns. But to civil rights advocates, not to mention many members of the communities in question, equity in place sounds suspiciously like separate but equal. There is, after all, a long tradition in American society of asking segregated communities to self-improve while remaining segregated. And really, when assessing the impact, we have to ask, are we okay with this, where it's equity in place, but basically we're saying separate but equal.
As administrators and leaders and as stakeholders, we have to ask ourselves, what do we value the most? Do we believe that integration can lead to success of all students? Are we ready to fight? Are we ready to create the change in our local and state policies to allow for integrated schools in our society? What are we willing to do to have our students be successful?